Welcome to Big Closet, Small Planet, made possible by the Loudest Foundation, the Relander Foundation, and Tencel, and produced in collaboration with Ecotextile News. I'm Mike Schrager. How many of you know what a factoid is? Factoids, right? Information reported and repeated so often that they become accepted as fact. In this new segment, Fact or Fiction, we're going to explore whether some of the commonly used factoids around apparel and sustainability are based on real substantial evidence. For instance, one factoid has been making its way throughout our industry for a while now, and it's the message that greenhouse gas emissions created by the fashion industry are larger than those created by international flights and shipping combined. Now, for many of us working in or with the apparel sector, that message was quite shocking, and it stimulated a lot of interest in mobilizing the industry to focus on climate action. And it is a message that has been repeated by many sources, including the United Nations. But are we confident that it is based on good research and evidence? Today, my two guests will hopefully help me sort this out. So I want to welcome Simon Glover and Sandra Roos. Welcome, both of you.
Hi, Mike.
Hello.
Hello. So, listen, both. Let's start with Simon. Maybe you can introduce yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Sure, Mike. I'm a journalist with the Ecotextile News magazine. I'm quite new to the textile industry. However, I've been working in journalism for more than 30 years now with newspapers, online news services, and via freelance agencies with most national newspapers. So that's me.
And Sandra.
Yes, my name is Sandra Roos, and I work at the Research Institute RISE in Sweden. And I hold a PhD in the area of environmental analysis of textiles. And I have been active in this textile research area for many years now, 12 years, I think. And for example, in the large Mistra Future Fashion project, which was an 11 million euro project, a very large project on fashion, from which I will discuss some of the findings today.
Thank you both for helping me out here. So I want to start with Simon. My understanding is you recently did an investigative report on this particular factoid. Why did you do an investigation and what did you find out?
Well, it actually came out of a conversation we were having in the newsroom, Mike. It struck us that there were some quite bold claims being made about the environmental impact of the industry. And one of those particularly grabbed our attention was this one about emissions from textiles being more than those of flights and shipping combined. And we thought it would just be worth looking into this a little bit closer to see if the science actually stacked up. We found that it went back to an Ellen MacArthur Foundation report a few years ago now. And as you said, it's since been repeated by almost everybody you can mention, from the United Nations to Greenpeace to the UK government. What the Ellen MacArthur Foundation claimed was that in the year 2015, emissions from textiles totaled 1.2 billion tonnes. And that, they said, was more than international flights and maritime shipping combined. Now, they had two sources for this. For textiles, they used a combination of their own conservative assumptions, as they described it, with analysis by the consultant McKinsey & Company, as I say, to provide a total figure of 1.2 billion tonnes. They contrasted this with statistics from the International Energy Agency, which estimated emissions from aviation and marine bunkers at 1.1 billion tonnes, although that was for 2014. So the first thing we thought, well, that's 2 different years and quite a narrow margin.
So you were curious. You wanted to go deeper now because you're like this is
exactly
these are not comparative sources or
it didn't seem the sources were different, the years were different. We weren't entirely convinced, so we thought we'd take a deeper look. It then struck us that for fashion and textiles, it's generally accepted that 80% of the carbon footprint is in the supply chain. Was that the case for aviation and shipping? We wondered. Were the emissions from the manufacture of all those planes and ships the building and operation of the ports and airports. Was that included? So we went back to the International Energy Agency, and they told us no, it wasn't. Their figures only included direct emissions.
Aha, that's a big difference
So
right there.
indeed. So they were also, that was the first bit of help they gave us. They were also able to give us figures for aviation and shipping separately, and also the textile and leather industry combined for every year right back until 1971. And this was fascinating because for every single year, textile and leather's emissions were much lower than either aviation or shipping. And we looked obviously particularly closely at 2015, the year quoted by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And for that year, they had emissions from textile and leather at actually 82.5 million tonnes, or just over. Whereas for aviation and shipping, when you added up the figures, it was 1.19 billion tonnes, 14 times higher than textile and leather. So it seemed to us that the fashion certainly didn't stack up. We went back to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, obviously to give them a chance to comment on what we'd discovered. They pointed out that their total included the emissions from textile production, including the growing of cotton, the production of plastics, textile production, etc. But we pointed out to them that the figures that they were using for flights and shipping didn't include any of these supply chain emissions. And this is what they told us. They admitted that the scope of the two numbers was markedly different, their words, but they said that they'd explicitly acknowledged that in their report, and they justified it on the grounds that they were trying to make a point about textiles, and they considered that internationals, flights and shipping were a well-known sources of emissions against which to compare.
So you, as a journalist, when they say this kind of thing, what do you say? Do you say, well, that's a fair benchmark, or are you saying, well, you're comparing apples and oranges? What was your view on that?
Well, very much apples and oranges, yeah. Our view was really that it felt like they'd gone a little bit back of the envelope and they were looking for something sensational to make people's eyebrows shoot to the top of their heads, which we felt when you looked very closely at it, the science didn't stack up and it couldn't really be justified. And we published a report in our magazine saying exactly that, which created quite a reaction, as you can imagine.
So I think this is fascinating, and we're going to bring you, Sandra, in a second. But I've been, I run a climate platform, a climate action platform here in the Nordic region. And John from Ecotextile News, your colleague, asked me to report a while back on what the impacts were. And when I did my interviews with a number of researchers, I got a range of different um, estimations about the climate impact of the industry, anywhere from 1.5% to 10%, and a lot of people wondering how could it be high if there are other industries that are around 8 or 10%. So I'm fascinated that you found that out. Were you, as a journalist, is this surprising?
Well, it was surprising in one way, in that in that that this claim had been made and repeated so widely. Some of the organisations which have just picked up this statistic and run with it, that it's quite incredible, really, that this should be the case, and that although nobody should dispute the severity of the climate change crisis, that really sort of what appeared to us to be back of the envelope sensationalism didn't really have any place.
Well, I know it had such an effect here in Sweden that uh, there were consumer organizations and groups who were arguing that Swedes should have not shame for flying, but they should have shame for buying clothes. We call it flight shaming or clothing purchases shaming. Anyway, I want to go to Sandra. Um, so you're a researcher. As a scientist, what do you think about when you hear about this kind of reporting and this kind of analysis?
Yes, I think that Simon and Ecotextile News have done a very important job. Because as a scientist, I'm troubled that these types of claims are made with no or very little science behind. And I think the alarming nature of these statements do in short term make people's eyebrows go to the back of their head. But when it turns out that it wasn't entirely truthful, people just lose their trust in this type of information. And to have institutions like the United Nations publishing claims on their website without references to the sources behind the facts is really troublesome in the long term. And UN should not spread myths. That's a big risk.
And yet we've galvanized the industry with this kind of messaging. So let's come back to that. But so you said it's on the UN website. What did you find still on the UN website?
Yeah, I looked into it today at this UN News website, and it still says that this UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, they still have it up that they consider the fashion industry to be the second most polluting industry in the world, which is a very old myth that I think, all in the textile industry now know is a myth. And they also state that the carbon emissions of the fashion industry are larger than for all international flights and maritime shipping combined. And there is no sources. So, I mean, from a scientist point of view, we teach the children in school how to judge the reliability of information. We teach them that traceability of information is a key. And then it's so troublesome that the United Nations is not being a good example.
Okay, so we've come to the conclusion that at least in this case, the evidence backing up this factoid seems to be based on apples and oranges, and it's not clearly sourced, and it could be very misleading. And we don't know how misleading it could be, though, because there is a sense that the industry does have a climate impact. But the question is it significant? Is it something we should be focusing on? Because the whole world is mobilizing around climate anyway. So I'm curious, Sandra, when you did your own desktop research to see where a lot of these figures are coming from, and and where the problems could be, what did you find out yourself?
Mm. Yes, I have compared 5 different sources, whereof 2 are my own, but 5 different sources. So the Ellen MacArthur report, the Quantis report, and then also a new report from the EEA, the European Environmental Agency. And they quantify the total impact of, in fact, different industries. So it can be the fashion industry, it can be the textile industry, or the clothing industry. And that will make a difference, of course. But I would like to start with saying that I think it's really important to make these quantifications if we are going to be able to reduce our climate emissions. We need to know how much do we emit today, and then we need to be able to calculate so that we really reduce 30% or even 50% perhaps until 2030.
Right. So you're committed to getting good analysis. So the reports that you looked at were a range of different sources, and they looked
Mm,
at defining textiles or the industry in different ways. Is that what you're telling me?
exactly. So I saw 3 challenges. The first one is the scope. The second is the data transparency. And then the third problem I see is whether we can have comparability at all between the sectors. But to start with the scope, the available reports, they differ in scope. So if we talk about the fashion industry, that would include clothes and shoes, but not home textiles and not technical textiles. If we talk about the textile industry, that would include all textiles, but no leather products. So then we have the agricultural textiles, geotextiles, technical textiles, etc. And finally, if we look at only the clothing industry, that would be a much more limited scope. And the scope is so important for the result because the consumption per person and year varies, of course, depending on if we include different types of products in the scope.
So that I get, that I
So,
understand. Okay.
yeah, so in these 5 reports, uh, it varies between 9 and 31 kilogram per person and year, how much we consume. And of course, that leads to differences in climate impact. And then also some exclude the use phase and include only production of products. And as in Simon's case, with the data about the transport sector, they only include the use phase. And
Okay.
yeah, so what? So we're definitely comparing apples and
Okay.
oranges.
So then what's the second problem you found?
That's the lack of transparency and correctness in some cases in the data. And whenever data cannot be reviewed, that means sort of it's not scientific facts. It's only hearsay, and that's the main problem, I think, with the report from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. That this McKinsey analysis or even conservative assumptions behind the data, it's not public. So it's only hearsay, it's guesswork. And since their results are in some cases also radically different from everything previously published, I mean, as a researcher, I must see the data behind to be able to see if it's correct or not. Because if there's no data that I can review and they come with a statement that is very different from everything that we know before, it seems very incorrect. So, I mean, in Mr. Future Fashion, we have gone through all publicly available data on environmental impact from fiber production, and only fiber then. And when I look in the Ellen MacArthur report, they state that the synthetic fiber production give rise to 11.9 kilogram of carbon dioxide per kilogram fiber. And that is an amazingly high number, because what we have found previously in literature is that it lies between 1.7 and 5.4. So 11.9, that's really high.
And you didn't see
And the only
anywhere, yeah, you
explanation,
didn't see anywhere where that
no,
was based on.
exactly. No, exactly. The only explanation we are given is from the McKinsey analysis.
Okay.
So, I mean, then the trustworthiness in this data, when it's not, there's nothing you can sort of go back to and review, and it's really high compared to other figures. The trustworthiness gets very low. And also with the EMF report, I looked at the figures on the global climate emissions, and IPCC reports them to be 42 gigatons per year, so 42 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. But the EMF report, they state that their 1.2 gigaton represents 2% of global emissions. And that would mean that the global emissions would be 60 gigatons. And that's also a very strange number when we know what IPCC have reported was 42 gigatons.
Aha. So if you scale that up, 2% according to the EMF means 60 gigatons globally for everything, and the IPCC just says 42. Okay.
Yeah, so their results doesn't really cohere with what other like very trustworthiness reports have found.
So then you said there was a third problem. What is that one?
And that is perhaps the most complicated, but to set percentages of climate emissions to different sectors, that's actually so difficult because all the sectors, they are integrated. So the textile industry, they are a part of the agricultural sector, they are a part of the energy production sector, transport sector, chemistry, chemical manufacturing sector. So when we calculate the emissions of the textile industry, a lot of these climate emissions comes from the energy production, and some come from maritime shipping and international flights. So when we compare the textile sector with, for example, the energy sector, there will be a lot of double counting because many emissions are sort of part of both sectors. And that means that the figures, they cannot just be simply taken as they are from different reports, but they always need to be judged from the original context.
So, Simon, are you with us? Is this making sense to you?
Yes, it does. I agree with what Sandra says. To be honest with you, it did strike us that by using their own assumptions, that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation had possibly found exactly what they wanted to find. Now, I don't want to use this as a stick to attack the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who do a lot of great work. But we did think it's very important that if statistics like this are going to be used to highlight the severity of the problem, they must be right, because if they're not accurate and people realize they're not accurate, then they're going to question everything they're told about climate change or about the environmental impact of fashion and textiles. And that makes it so much harder to get the message across that things do need to change.
So let me ask Sandra. There was a Qantas report that also came out that you also looked at. Um, is that a better source of information? Because I also spoke to them, and very nice and professional folks. But there's again a question of how big the actual impact is, and they said, that their estimates from their methodology was that the apparel sector, and again, I don't recall exactly how they defined it, was 6.7% of the total global emissions for apparel and 1.4% for footwear, right? And again, using your analysis, I can imagine we need to figure out what does that mean, what it's in and out of that. But how trustworthy is that source, do you think?
Mm. I think that they have a good methodology and they are a bit more transparent, though they do not show their background data either, which means that um, they mostly get a little bit too high, and sometimes they get very much higher than the other sources. I mean, nobody really knows what is the impact, but when we compare with different sources, and some report sticks out compared to the other sources, then we sort of need to have an explanation of that. And I have contacted the research team at Quantis, and I also think that they are very professional, though they do not share data, and we haven't really found a good explanation to why they get so high. But I also think that many misuse their 8% figure, as it is clearly stated, just like you did, Mike, that 6.7% is for apparel and 1.4 for footwear. And still I hear people cite it as 8% for clothes, for example.
Right. Well, they could be meaning just 8% for apparel, which includes shoes and clothing. So I guess it depends how you define again what we're
Mm.
talking about. So I'd like to tie this up by asking you, Sandra, what would we need to do to get this right, to get a trustworthy calculation? I know that the UN initiative is working on a decarbonization pathway now, so it needs to be based on, credible analysis. I understand the World Resources Institute is working on that. So, what would you advise them?
Yes, I would like to encourage all actors that spread different figures to check the source and also state the source when they spread the figures so that we can stop these myths from spreading. And as I said in the beginning, I think that we really must quantify our emissions today so that we can know that we really did reduce our climate emissions by 30% or perhaps 50% in 10 years. And what we need to do is to be accurate with what the data represents. Is it fashion, leather, textile, home textiles, etc.? And never exaggerate numbers to get attention. And then the sort of one side is calculate how much do we emit, but then on the other side we want to calculate how much do we reduce. So regarding this decarbonization pathway, again the scope will be a challenge because there will be a lot of double counting when all actors will want to claim the credits from each reduction as eligible for their sector. So I think we will need to make agreements on how to allocate each saving. So if we take the case of energy production for a textile mill again, if climate emissions are reduced with 100 tons of carbon dioxide per year, is it the energy sector that reduce their emissions with 100 tons? Or is it the textile sector? Because if both the energy and the textile sector reports that they have a reduction of 100 tons, that will of course lead to a reported reduction of 200 tons. But both sectors report the same reduction.
Right. So then there's a question of who should take the responsibility for that. Is it
Mm.
those who are creating the demand for the use of that energy? So in this case, right, the apparel sector brands who are selling, they source from suppliers who use that energy. And if those brands didn't sell those products, then that energy wouldn't be demanded to produce those products. I guess you're saying. So there is a question about who has the responsibility and who should take accountability for that, right? Um,
Mm.
and what would you say? What would you say, given what you know? So now I know I'm going back against what we're talking about here. So we're going out a little bit on thin ice. But given what you know, and I know you have to define the parameters. But what would you say would the range be of what the impact is actually of the apparel industry globally? Is it 0.5%? Is it 12%? What would you imagine it being, given what you know?
Mm. Yeah, exactly. What we do know, and I think are quite reliable figures, is that producing 1 kilogram of product, textile or leather product, the impact of that lies between 25 and 40, so roughly about maybe 30 kilograms of carbon dioxide, cradle to gate, no use phase. So if we then take the global consumption of fashion or apparel or whatever, depending on the scope, we consume around 10 to 15 kilograms per person of year. So if we take the how much we consume, 10 to 15 kilograms, times the climate emission per product, and then I just made a rough calculation of 8 billion people on the earth. That leaves us with a span of between 2 and 8 gigatons. So we are actually here over the figure that Ellen MacArthur Foundation came out with. But then I must sort of state again that that includes all scopes. So scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 emissions are part in this calculations. But between 2 and 8 gigatons of carbon dioxide.
Right, and for our listeners who are not technical, scope three is generally everything outside a company's direct ownership or control. So for a brand, that's the whole supply chain, as well as the emissions created when a customer uses the product. Um, and so,
Exactly.
not to
So
confuse
the
everyone, but I just
yeah,
wanted people to know that, right? So you're saying that the estimate is that the impact of the industry is 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 could be estimated to be bigger than to be significant, but the estimates used for flights and shipping before did not include scope 3, did not include their supply chain. So they're not
exactly.
comparable. Okay. But yet that's still, I'm guessing, even though you haven't given me a percentage of the global uh, climate footprint, what is the percentage then of the global climate
Mm.
footprint?
Yeah, if we use the IPCC figure of 42, then we get between 4 and 12 then of the total global climate emissions,
4
4
and
to
12%.
12%.
So that broad
Mm.
range. So in a world where we need to get down to zero or negative, that's still important. But 4% versus 12 is a big difference, don't you think?
Absolutely. And so depending on what we want to use this percentage for, because they do include part of the emissions from transport, agriculture, energy, chemicals, and so on. And maybe we should not use these figures to sort of compare between sectors, but to actually see that we can work together between sectors to reduce the emissions.
So Simon, as a journalist, what do you think now? Is there any what can we learn from this? Any advice you can give as we move forward?
Well, I guess the obvious one is to double check everything we're told and to take everything with a pinch of salt. The the figures that are being bandied about, some of them do seem too incredible to be true, and in this case, we certainly found that was the case. And if people do bandy about uh, exaggerated figures to justify an argument, the danger is, of course, is that the argument won't be taken seriously once we learn that the figures don't stack up. So yeah,
And yet maybe they didn't even need to use that comparison. Maybe there were other comparisons were equally valid that show the impact, but not that particular one,
indeed,
maybe.
nobody's really doubting the scale and the severity of the problem. It's just the way that it was being expressed in this case, which uh, we would argue does more harm than good.
Thank you both very much for trying to uncover this for us. So I think we have a goal of trying to get some standard analysis that we can all understand and can be transparent and we can use as the basis. So thank you both very much for joining me.